of 2 queries into UK space policy. Chris sits on a number of boards, including the BIS, the SpaceLink Learning Foundation, the Eluna Foundation, the Room Space Journal, and is an advisor to the Initiative of Interstellar Studies and the Moon Village Association, and is vice chair of the World Space Week Association. He is also Global Space Advisory to Space Hero. Chris is a frequently commentator on space and astronautics and has made more than 300 televisions and radio broadcasts. He also has a significant track record in both space education or outreach and in higher education, receiving the 2019 Sir Arthur Clary Award for Space Education and 2015 IAF Distinguished Service Award. Congratulations for this, sir. Among
Thank you
his
very much.
other achievements, yeah, are he was one of the final 20 candidates for the 1991 UK USSR Juno mission to the Mir space station. Wrote that he believes to be the first ever paper on extrantational garden design and has a poem on the International Space Station. Thanks for accepting our invitation, sir. Over to you. You can carry on.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you very much to everybody who has turned out on a Friday evening to watch this talk. And thank you for, as Vice Chair of the World Space Week Association, thank you for what you have all done to promote World Space Week, which is very much appreciated. So let me share my presentation with you. Okay, can you just confirm that you can see my slides, just to make absolutely sure? Either audio or in the chat window, just say, yes, you can see the slides.
Yes, sir, we can see the slides.
Excellent, thank you very much. Just to make sure, one time I was giving a presentation and I thought people could see them, but they couldn't. So this talk is called Black Sky Thinking. It's a kind of riff, if you like, on the idea of blue sky thinking, futuristic open thinking. But the black sky here refers to the black of space rather than the sort of blue of the sky that we see on Earth here. And so the rough outline of the talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about space and money, and then I'm going to say what I mean by new space. Talk about some of the domains that we can consider for operating in for new space, run through some new space companies, say a little bit about the space and lunar legal regime, because I think that's relevant, and then finally briefly come back to space and money again. So this is an infographic by the company Bryce, who specialize in space consultancy, and this came out maybe 10 days ago. And it shows the breakdown of the global space economy, which according to their estimates is worth about $370 billion. And there are a few kind of key aspects to it. First of all, this section up here in the top left, this kind of brown quarter, this is effectively government space spending on, non-satellite aspects. So you can see here, for example, 21 billion on NASA for their space part, 13 billion for the US Air Force, and so on. And you can see how this breaks down. And there's Europe, there's China, there's Russia, and just so India is on there. I know that looks a small sliver compared to some of them, but it's still $1.5 billion every year, which is not a small amount. So India is up there in the big space nations. And you can see how this is split between, this is all the US government budget and this is non-US government. So you can see that this whole area is the United States government spend on space in various areas. This other 3/4, okay, this is all to do with putting satellites in orbit. And we can see a few key things from there. First of all, this bit here, this is 12.5 billion, a lot of money, but that's actually the building of satellites. And even smaller here, this is launch services. So although I suspect a lot of us, when we think of space and we think of space activities, we think of satellites being launched in rockets, the building of those satellites and the launch of them is a relatively small amount. The overall biggest part is this bit here, which is commercial satellite services. And of these, the biggest one, 92 billion, the single biggest bit is satellite television. So depending on what your feelings are about space, you may be keen on human space flight and space exploration and the rest of it. That's all funded out of this stuff up here. This is where the money is being made in space, okay? In terms of satellites, this is fixed satellite systems, so that's telephones and so on. And then this enormous bit down here, 130 billion, this is on satellite ground equipment. So this is on all the stuff you need on the ground to support the satellites. So although we get the most glamorous pictures from the building and launching of the satellites, most of the commercial money at the moment is coming from here. But of course, this represents the development of history into the current day. It's more old space than it is new space. You can see this in a little bit more detail here. So this is the satellite services bit. So you can again see the satellite manufacturing, the launch industry, and then that is satellite services, and that is ground equipment. And then this part of the infographic shows you how the different sections are broken down within that. But key message is, yes, television from space makes a lot of money. When you look at the different sorts of satellites here, again, you can see, most of the satellites being built are commercial communication satellites. Then there's remote sensing satellites, and then a much smaller number of other satellites. So let's come on to new space. I imagine that most of you have heard the term new space and may be familiar with it, but sometimes not. So I'm going to sort of explain what is meant by new space. Although the term new space itself is now actually quite an old term. It's being used for 10, 15 years at least. So historically, space was carried out by big aerospace companies. The early days of the space endeavor, it was big aircraft companies who then started building rockets and satellites, usually for governments. And this is what is old space. It's very big. It's very expensive. It's because it's mostly government funded. And there's a very kind of cozy relationship. It's between the government and the companies. And so that's called old space or traditional space or trad space. New space tends to be, not always exclusively, but tends to be, first of all, privately funded as opposed to being funded by governments. It's entrepreneurial. So people are looking for interesting new ideas and new approaches, and in particular focused on low-cost approaches, because it's a very different approach if you're a company between doing something because the government wants to pay you for it, and the government is very rich, and doing something for your own business where you want it to cost as little as possible. And so here in the pictures, we can see some examples. In the top left-hand one, that's an example of a CubeSat structure. I'll be saying more about CubeSats later on. At the bottom left, that's one of Bigelow Aerospace's concepts for a space hotel using an inflatable module. They never actually got to fly that, but they did fly some inflatable modules. Unfortunately, Bigelow have now pretty much ceased operating. I think everyone's heard of SpaceX. I'll be talking more about SpaceX later on, but the Falcon family of rockets. And then at the bottom here, a rover. This was a design by a US company called Astrobotic, and I'll be mentioning Astrobotic again later in the talk. So I like to think about the domains in which we can operate. And these can be split into three, really, when we're considering space activities. There's suborbital, there's orbital, and there's deep space. And I'll say a little bit about each of those as to explain what I mean. Where does space start? Well, it's generally accepted that it starts at something called the von Karman line, which is generally accepted to be 100 kilometers above the surface of the Earth. So if you pass, through that line, say that's the red line there, if you travel beyond that, you are in space and you are now an astronaut. Down here, you're not an astronaut. Up here, you are. But of course, that just requires you to travel through the line. You could just go up and come back again. And that's what a suborbital flight is. It's a flight where you have enough propulsion, enough velocity to get you, above that von Karman line, but then you will fall back to Earth. And this is typically used by sounding rockets, but also being considered by some of the space tourism companies. If you want to get into orbit, that's a different situation, because to get into orbit, you not only need to get high enough, you need to be traveling fast enough. So to a certain extent, a suborbital flight is like throwing something up into the sky and then letting it come back down again. Here, you have to gain enough velocity so that you end up in orbit, which for a typical low Earth orbit around the Earth is about 7.8 kilometers a second. So it's much more difficult to get into orbit than it is to do a suborbital flight. Nevertheless, if you're looking to fly tourists, they can get a nice view of the Earth on a suborbital flight. So tourism is one significant commercial suborbital opportunity. And you can see here again the idea. Now, this is an old slide. This was this image here was originally produced by the X Prize back in the late 1990s, when the space shuttle was still flying and the Mir space station was still up there. But you can see this is the von Karman line, and this is an example of an X Prize or space tourism trajectory. You go up, you pass through the 100 kilometers. You have a period of microgravity at the top, so that the tourists can float around, and then you come back down again. So a relatively short flight. But you can also use this for microgravity science. So in this period at the top, okay, you can, if you don't want to go to the expense of launching a payload into space, you can do microgravity research here. Obviously, you can investigate the atmosphere, and it's also useful for demonstrations of technology in microgravity as well. In principle, you could also use this over a more extended distance for point to point. So if you wanted to go from India to France, instead of getting in a plane, you could get in a suborbital rocket. And that idea has been proposed by Elon Musk using his Starship rocket. Whether we will see that, I don't know. But it would make for rapid delivery of certainly packages. You could get something on Amazon Super Express maybe from one side of the planet to another in a couple of hours, and also maybe people, although it would be not such a relaxing ride as traveling by plane. Then when we go up into orbit, obviously we have sent many spacecraft into orbit in the past, and here are some examples of the sort of things we can do. We can broadly classify satellite missions to be one of two sorts. They're either doing something for people on the Earth and they're looking back, and these are all examples of satellites and images from those satellites which have been looking back at the Earth. So this is a Meteosat, a European meteorological satellite, and here you can see an image it takes of the cloud cover over Europe. This is NVSat, remote sensing satellite, and you can just see down here, this is Greece, and this shows a forest fire plume in Greece, and so on. So this is a typical thing you can do in low Earth orbit. Obviously, we also can look outwards away from the Earth, and this shows some images that have been achieved using orbiting telescopes. This one is in the gamma ray frequency, and this shows our galaxy. This is the cosmic background radiation, the 3K echo, if you like, of the Big Bang. This shows in the infrared a star formation region. And this is the Hubble deep field, where the Hubble looked at a small amount of space for a long period of time and could just see lots and lots and lots and lots of galaxies. So many, many galaxies. So that's what we currently do in low Earth orbit and somewhat further out. And So here are the commercial opportunities: Earth applications, communications, remote sensing, navigation, and positioning are the three things that we can now do. It's now would be very odd to have a smartphone that didn't have navigation and positioning. I'm old enough to remember when a satellite navigation receiver, was the size of a refrigerator, and now they're so small that we can get them into phones and many other objects. Communications, as we've seen, is the big area that's made money so far, mostly using geostationary satellites, but this is an example of a constellation, one of the earliest constellations, not particularly financially successful, Iridium. In fact, it went bankrupt. But we do now see more ideas for constellations from Elon Musk and also Jeff Bezos and also other companies as well. You can also do research. You can put experiments on space stations. You can put experiments on satellites or other sorts of platforms. Here we see a couple of CubeSats that have just been launched from the International Space Station. Obviously, tourism is a possibility, trips to space stations and space hotels, and I'll come back to that later on in the talk. A new area that is also an old area is in-orbit satellite launch and servicing. For a long time, for decades, it's been apparent that we've been following a model where we build a satellite and we throw it into space on a rocket, and then we can't do anything with it. It operates until it runs out of fuel, or its solar arrays wear out, or its batteries don't work anymore, and then it's dead. And what everyone has said was, wouldn't it be nice if we could, refuel satellites, repair them, and upgrade them? And this has always been true, but you have to have assets, you have to have infrastructure in orbit to allow you to do this. So that 25, 30 years ago was being looked at, and then it was decided it was too expensive, but now it's coming back again, and we're seeing more companies looking to offer these sort of services. And then finally, unfortunately, one of the things that human beings do when they go places is to make a mess of them. We put a lot of debris into space, and now we're realizing it's a problem. And so there might be a commercial opportunity to capture and deorbit debris. The question here is who actually pays for it. As long as there's somebody to pay for it, a company can make money from it. But there are arguments about whose responsibility it is to pay for it, because quite frankly, most of this debris was created by Russia and the United States. And a lot of other countries think that, well, if Russia and the United States created it, Russia and the United States should pay to get rid of it. You won't be surprised, possibly, that the politicians in Russia and the United States don't agree with that. So who is going to pay for this is a question that has to be addressed. And then finally, deep space, by which I mean beyond geostationary orbit. Here's the wonderful pictures of the places that we have orbited or flown by, all these different planets, Saturn, Jupiter, Io, Europa, Neptune, Uranus. And my favorite these days is Pluto, because again, when I was a child, Pluto was just this, concept, if you like. It was if I'd ever seen Pluto, it was just as a little dot on a photographic plate. But nobody kind of really had any idea what it looked like. And then when New Horizons flew past it, it suddenly became an actual world, which was very nice. And we've also actually landed on some places. So Mars on the left there, Titan at the top, Venus on the right there, the slightly reddy one, obviously the moon, and the Churyumov-Gerasimenko and Ryugu in terms of asteroids and comets. So these are the sort of places we've been so far. What might we do commercially in the future? Well, there's research that can be done in space, almost as many sorts of research as you can think of, except, obviously the big thing in space is that it's in microgravity. And here in this picture on the left, this shows you the first object that was 3D printed on the International Space Station. So that was an example of scientific and technical research, because obviously for astronauts on future long duration space missions, you can't necessarily take all the tools you want with you, but if you can make them as you go when you need them, that's excellent. Also, if we're going to do human space flights, particularly long duration missions, we need to know, what effects space has on human beings. So human performance in space research. I've just seen a yellow thing come across the screen. I don't know what that is. I didn't do it, but anyway. Extraterrestrial resource utilization is another one. That's a bit of a mouthful, but it basically means using the resources we find in space. So this could be the moon, or it could be an asteroid that we extract materials from. Again, this has changed a bit in the past. When people looked at asteroids, they were particularly interested in the platinum iridium group metals because they were very valuable on Earth. But very complex to remove in space. And actually, it's kind of pivoted now. People are more interested in finding sources of water to use both to support human beings, but also just as a straight propellant, not even splitting it into oxygen and hydrogen, but just using it in an electric thruster. So, there's those possibilities. Plus also energy generation in space. That's a possibility too. Again, some of these ideas have been around multiple times. So what's called space-based solar power is currently on its third iteration. The first one was when I was probably around about the age of most of you, when I was an undergraduate, when the first space-based solar power studies by Glaser came out. They didn't go anywhere. Then about 15, 20 years ago, there was a second wave of interest, and now just at the moment there's a third wave of interest in space-based solar power. So that may be another way of using space. Space-based manufacturing, obviously, if you have materials in space, you can build things in space, so you don't have to transport them from the Earth. And tourism, the ultimate trip. There are companies that, in principle, will sell you a trip around the moon, not yet landing on the moon. So that's a possibility as well, as long as you're incredibly rich. And then settlement, establishing humans in space and on other bodies. So you might ultimately have people out there doing some of these things as opposed to robots. So those are the kind of three domains and a kind of overview of the different opportunities. Now I'm going to talk about some of the companies, and it has to be some of the companies. When I was in my 20s, I knew basically all the space companies in the world because there weren't really very many. There were some in the US, there were a few in Europe, one or two in other countries. Now there are so many space companies, that I don't know them all. And every day I'm finding out about a new startup. So it's a very different situation. There's a lot more opportunities, a lot more possibilities. But probably one of the most well-known ones is Virgin, because as soon as the X Prize was won in 2004, Sir Richard Branson, the chief executive, set up Virgin Galactic as a company to fly tourists. And you can see here, this is the carrier aircraft, and this is the spacecraft, if you like, which drops off and then flies up to space and then changes its configuration before coming back down again. And this is an example of a suborbital flight. It takes advantage of the fact that it doesn't build up a very high velocity, and that minimizes the thermal impact of when it comes back down through the atmosphere. It's turned out to be way more complicated, though, than I think Branson thought, because this was 16 years ago, and they still haven't actually flown, paying customers to space. Wouldn't surprise me to see it happen later this year. I think if it wasn't for COVID, that might be the case. Or if not this year, then next year. But they have also split off part of the company. So we now have Virgin Orbit as well. Virgin Orbit is dedicated to offering low-cost small satellite launch. So instead of having this vehicle under the carrier aircraft, they have a rocket, and the rocket gets dropped off at high altitude and then carries the payload up to orbit. I'm sure that pretty much everybody has heard of SpaceX, but it's interesting to know how it worked out. Elon Musk was a co-founder of PayPal, and when he sold his share in PayPal, he had enough money to basically to set up a rocket company. It was touch and go whether SpaceX was going to be successful, and it came close to failing, but it actually succeeded. And now, thanks, I think we need to be clear, to significant financial support from the US government in terms of contracts for providing services, it's doing very well. So, for instance, it has a 1.6 billion NASA contract to deliver cargo and astronauts now to the International Space Station. It also has contracts with the United States Air Force to launch satellites. So it is a business, it is commercial, but one has to acknowledge the fact that the US government has put in multiple billions of dollars. And if you're trying to do business in space, you can't always assume that you will have a customer who will be that wealthy. On the other hand, you have Blue Origin, which is owned by Jeff Bezos, who is the owner of Amazon and is the richest man in the world. And he has been interested in space since he was a young person. When he was a university student, he was a member of a student space society, and he always, wanted to be involved in space. But he decided the best way to do it was, I think, to become very rich first and then use the money. So he set up this company called Blue Origin. Very different approach to SpaceX, at least in terms of publicity. For years, nobody really knew what Blue Origin were doing. They didn't publicize what they were up to. They were very close-mouthed, and it was only recently in the company's lifetime that they've started demonstrating what they can do. And this is all been paid for by Jeff Bezos privately. So it's his company, he owns it. They have just started taking one or two contracts from the US government again for satellite launches, and they've started selling rocket motors to other people. So the engines they build for their own rockets, they're also selling to other people, the BE-4, for example. But it is very different. He has basically financed this privately, and every time he needs some more money, he sells some more Amazon stock and puts more money into the company. They started off with suborbital flights, and here you can see the rocket on the way up, and you can see the rocket landing again. They plan to start flying people into space in that capsule that's on the top of the rocket. It's got very nice big windows, so you can get a good view. The capsule comes back by parachute, and the rocket comes back and lands on the pad. And they've flown, multiple times. So it's quite a reliable system. But they are working on bigger and bigger rockets. So soon we will start to see them doing orbital flights, and we'll start seeing them fly people on the New Shepard here. So probably commercially starting next year. So the rockets are the kind of sexy end of things. Who doesn't like rockets? They're big, they're noisy, they're spectacular as they go into space. And here's a new take, an interesting take on rockets from a commercial launch point of view. So there's a company, it's a US company, it's called Rocket Lab. It has a subsidiary in New Zealand that it operates, and they have a rocket called the Electron, which they use to launch small satellites. And what's interesting about this is that they effectively 3D print their own engines, their liquid powered engines. And also what's very interesting, that these engines are battery powered. I don't know how familiar you all are with rocket engines, but in general, when you have a launch vehicle engine, you have turbo pumps which have to pump the propellant and the oxidizer into the combustion chamber. And these turbo pumps are powered by effectively tapping off power from the rocket engine. Here, they've taken a much simpler approach, and they have battery-powered liquid engines with electric pumps, which again, simplifies the rocket. And they have been launching since they started, a large number of satellites very quickly. In the last 3 years, they've launched 55 satellites on 11 rockets. So that's quite a transformational capability. And there are many, many companies around the world who are trying to design and create small satellite launchers, many more companies than the market can actually bear. So some of these will be successful, but some of them will fail because there's just not a big enough market at the moment. But it will, I hope, bring the cost of sending payloads to space down even further, which will make it easier for all those of us who want to actually send things into space. Moving away from rockets, let's look at what I would call launch services now. And this slide is about a company called NanoRacks, which was the first space payload services company. In the past, if I wanted to send a payload into space, for example, I'm based in France at the moment. So first of all, I would have to get the French government's agreement because everything that gets launched into space has to effectively belong to some country. And then if it was going to go into the space station to the American section, then there would have to be an agreement with NASA and the US government, and the paperwork would be extremely complicated. And one of NanoRacks' big initiatives was signing an agreement with NASA, Space Act Agreement it's called, so that they could provide commercial access to the space station. So if I want to fly something with NanoRacks, I basically give my payload to NanoRacks, I give them money, and they fly it to the space station, and they handle all the interface with NASA. It's treated as a US payload. I don't have to get a governmental, position. So it's permission. It's much more like a commercial service. And since then, they have extended that from payloads going to the International Space Station to other regimes and other areas. So you can see on the bottom left, for NASA agreement for payloads, they're talking about flying payloads on the Blue Origin New Shepard rocket, and also with Airbus to go on an external platform on the outside of the space station, while at the same time they've started launching CubeSats. So the CubeSats get taken up to the space station, usually in a SpaceX capsule. They get unloaded into the space station, and then they get passed through an airlock into this deployer, and then they get effectively ejected from that deployer. Now, that means the CubeSats end up in the same orbit as the space station. So it's not suitable for all missions. It depends whether you need to be in a particular orbit or not. But if you just need your CubeSats to be in space, this is a cost-effective way of doing it. As you can see there, 30 to 60K for the smallest size, the 10 by 10 by 10 1U CubeSat. I should mention another company, a European company that's newer to the market, but is trying to do the same thing as NanoRacks. And this is called IceCubes. It's run by a Belgian company based in Brussels called Space Application Services. And so they are doing a similar thing, except if you send a payload with them, instead of going to the American part of the International Space Station, it goes to this module here, which is the European Columbus module on the International Space Station. This is the facility they go into. So you can see they're all designed to take these cube-based payloads. And this one and this one, the two black cubes here, these are two International Space University payloads that went to the space station. And this one here is still on the space station, I'm pleased to say. So we have very small, compact experiments in those. And again, you can literally, if you've got the money, you can go to IceCubes and say, I want to fly my payload, and they take care of liaising with the European Space Agency, liaising with the launch vehicle, which is again typically SpaceX at the moment. And so it's much easier for you as the researcher to focus on the payload and the science you want to do, or art in one case. One of those payloads is actually an art payload, rather than having to deal with lots and lots of paperwork. Planet is a famous company. They were the first people to really deploy CubeSats successfully commercially, and here you can see a whole rack of them, founded in 2010. They're a remote sensing company. You'll pardon me if I boast a little bit and say that Robbie Shingler there is a graduate of the ISU MSc program. And what they were trying to do was to provide pretty much continuous remote sensing cover of the planet using a low-cost small-sat constellation. Obviously, there's a limit to the resolution that you can get, but they have gone on to be, extremely successful, and also, bought up some other satellite companies as well. Spire is another company. I'm going to boast even more now, I'm afraid, because these three men here, these are all my former MSc students as well. They were on the course a decade ago when I first became the program director, and they actually set the company up while they were students. It took them a while to become, successful, but now, they have, probably more than 500 million in capital. I don't know exactly. And they've deployed more than 100 CubeSats. They replace them every 2 to 3 years. And this is what is different with the CubeSat commercial approach from the old space. A typical lifetime for a normal old style big satellite might be 10 to 15 years, because it's very difficult to get it up there. It's very expensive. You have to make it reliable. So you want to get a lot of use out of it. And that means the technology stays relatively static. Here, you can replace the technology with every new satellite. So you're constantly improving. Every time you launch a new satellite or a new set of satellites, the technology is better. So this enables you to increase your capability, much, much more quickly than you can do with some of the big satellites. This is a very interesting set of satellites as well. They're a bit bigger than CubeSats, to be honest, but nevertheless, they use synthetic aperture radars, which typically were considered to be the sort of thing you would fly on only big spacecraft, because you need quite a lot of power to power the radar. But this Finnish company have actually proved that you can do SAR, synthetic aperture radar, on small satellites, and they've launched their constellation and are continuing to do so, and have managed to provide, as it says in the middle bullet point, 1/4 meter resolution, and also to deliver data from space to a customer within 5 minutes of capture, which is really quite impressive. And you can see that they just, last month, we've gone through what's called Series C financing. So that means they've raised $152 million since 2014, having just last month received this $87 million. So they're doing very well. But take another view. Okay, we touched on space tourism earlier, and that is also I got a message that the host muted me. I don't know why. Okay, I'll keep talking and see what happens. So space tourists, there was a time and when this company, Space Adventures, who were the first space tourism company, would fly you to the space station if you could afford it. And that was about $25 million per person for a week on the International Space Station. That means that only a limited number of people could go. But you can see here, and there's a lot of tech millionaires effectively here. That's almost exclusively. That's these people background, and in particular this one here, Charles Simonyi. Okay, he's one of the 3 co-founders of Microsoft. He's not as famous as Bill Gates, but if you look here, you can see here he's actually been to the space station twice. So, obviously a very rich man. This is the one who isn't a tech millionaire. I think you could probably guess that from the fact that he has a red nose. That's Guy Laliberté, who is the founder and owner of Cirque du Soleil. Don't know if you've heard of it, but it's a very big global brand for sort of effectively a circus and entertainment. This stopped in 2010 because that was when the space shuttle stopped flying. What was happening with Space Adventures is they were buying a seat in the Soyuz capsule from the Russians. The Soyuz capsule can contain 3 people, and you would send up a commander and an engineer in 2 of the seats, and the third one could be free and could be sold to a tourist. through Space Adventures. But once the space shuttle stopped flying, that third seat was needed to fly Americans and other nationalities to the space station. So that was the end of human beings going to space, or paying for going to space until recently. I think. Sorry. So things are moving on, though. Obviously, we have SpaceX, which can carry people to the space station now, as we've seen recently. And also, NASA has changed its attitude recently. It's now open to the idea of commercial opportunities and private astronauts going back to the space station. It charges $35,000 a night, which is quite expensive. But the really expensive part is actually getting to space. If you can afford a launch, you can afford to stay on the space station for a few days. There's a company based in Houston with some people who running it who used to work for NASA and Axiom Space, and they are designing a module, a commercial module where people could stay, which they want to attach to the International Space Station in the first instance. And then, as you can see from this timeline here, okay, they in due course want to have their own private space station. In the meantime, if you want to go to the space station now, you can contact Axiom, and they will sell you a 10-day flight at some cost. And one of my students from last year just let us know 2 weeks ago that he is now working for Axiom, and that is what he's actually doing. He's there trying to sell, 10-day flights to rich people. Connected with this opening, I mentioned when I was introduced that I'm an advisor to Space Hero. Space Hero, you may or may not have heard about them, but Space Hero is going to be a global reality television show, and the prize for it will be, for the winner, a trip to the International Space Station. So if you're interested in that, you can, for the time being, go to their website, which is spacehero.me, and you can just fill in the thing to enter your email. If you're interested in being potentially more involved, they're running a thing at the moment called the Space Hero Insider Program. They're looking for people to build into a global network. You can apply for that, and then your application will be assessed. And if you're lucky, you'll become part of the Space Hero Insider Program when it launches in a couple of months. So there's a little kind of advert in the lecture. Although I'm an advisor for Space Hero, I don't actually get paid anything for it. So I'm just doing it because I think it's a really good idea to fly as many people in space as possible. And Space Hero enables people who are not professional astronauts and who are not millionaires to at least have the chance to fly in space. And I would certainly very much like to go to space, although I suspect I'm probably getting a little old for that now, unfortunately. I'm still younger than some of the oldest astronauts, though, so we will see. Moving away from people again, let's come back to the moon. The moon is in the news at the moment because of the Americans' plan to land there by 2024. Although honestly, I don't think they're going to be able to do that. I think it's just there's too much to do in the time available to get humans back onto the moon. But we'll see. If they prove me wrong, they prove me wrong. But in the area of commerce, NASA has set up what it's called CLPS, the Commercial Lunar Payload Services. And this is where NASA actually pays companies to design, build, and fly small lunar landers and small rovers to support their main Artemis program. And so far, they've given contracts to these three companies: Astrobotic at the top there, Intuitive Machines, that's the black one, and Masten Space Systems on the right, the 3D image. And in fact, this month they've gone a stage further to say that they would actually buy lunar regolith and lunar rocks from private companies. So what they're saying is, we're interested in doing scientific research on lunar rocks. If you bring rocks back from the moon, we will pay you for them. So they will, effectively pay to do stuff that they, did themselves in the past. So NASA saying, We don't need to actually send people to the moon to get to the rocks. You can bring them back and do that commercially. So we will see. I think Astrobotic is the first one of these that's due to launch in principle later this year. I mentioned earlier that under space resources that water was becoming more interesting than other things in terms of mining and extracting extraterrestrial resources. And this company here, Orbit Fab, was set up 2 years ago to respond to that. And they think that water is definitely going to be the preferred fuel in space. Because it's easier to handle and because you can get it from the moon or you can get it from asteroids. And they want to be a company that actually provides in-orbit refueling. So in this bottom slide, you can see an artist's image, which shows a satellite which is coming up to dock with this refueling facility to be refueled before it moves away again. And they've already flown experimental payloads to the space station. So what you can see at the top there, although it's maybe not terribly clear, is them doing some testing of their technology inside the space station. And this is matched. There's a company called Momentous, which wants to be an in-space transportation company. So they want to effectively provide orbital tugs to move things around and to deliver payloads in space. And they are expecting to use water-based propulsion as well. It doesn't give you the highest performance, but you're not necessarily looking for the highest performance. You're looking for a system that allows you to operate profitably. And sometimes that isn't the thing that gives you the highest performance. So that's the end of my survey of the lunar companies, the new space companies. But I wanted to come back on the idea of extraterrestrial resource exploitation, because legally this is a little bit contentious, shall we say, or some people think it's contentious. The United Nations has a thing called UN COPRUS, the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, and this is a forum for governments to talk to each other and to agree things about how we're going to operate in space. And back in 1967, the Outer Space Treaty was signed, and it says, as you can see there, the exploration and use of outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies, shall be carried out for the benefit and in the interests of all countries, irrespective of their degree of economic or scientific development, and shall be the province of all mankind. So what that basically means is, it shouldn't be down to some countries to rush off into space and to make use of the facilities, the resources, and to make lots of money and keep it all themselves. We've already seen that happen on Earth, in the past. And I think that's a very worthy aim. The issue is, though, that it's not easily enforceable. On Earth, when we have laws, we have police forces who will, enforce the law. If you break it, in international law, that doesn't really exist. Here we can see that there's a difference of opinion, and 3 countries now on the Earth have actually enacted national legislation: the US, Luxembourg, and the United Arab Emirates, the UAE, which says that if you're a company based in our country, it's fine for you to go and do stuff in space and profit from it directly. Our laws permit that. So it's difficult to know how that's going to go. There was a specific moon treaty put forward, which again reinforces this, but it's considered a failed treaty because it was ratified by only 18 countries in the world, and none of the countries that actually do human space exploration, so the United States, most of the European Union, FSU, the former Soviet Union, so Russia, Kazakhstan, etc., China and Japan, they haven't signed it. So the Moon Treaty is kind of a bit dead. So it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out. What that means is, as far as a US space lawyer is concerned, it's perfectly legal for one of those CLIPS missions to go to the moon, to bring back rocks and to sell them to NASA for money and make profit. In other countries, that might not be legal. if that country had signed the Outer Space Treaty. And I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know how this is going to play out. But it is a concern. They've been trying to address the development of new space and space commerce at UN COPRUS for some years, but it's very difficult because new space moves very fast. New ideas, new technologies, new approaches, whereas the UN tends to move very slowly, and trying to get any change to existing law has proved to be almost impossible. So how that will affect new space, particularly extraterrestrial resource utilization, remains to be seen. If can you legally go to the moon, extract the water, and then sell it to somebody else as rocket propellant? I don't know. Some lawyers I know say yes, and some lawyers I know say no. But okay, something will happen, because again, I want to finish the talk by coming back to money. This is a slide from about 5 years ago to give you a kind of snapshot then from the Silicon Valley Space Center, and it's showing you the investment in various space companies. And over on the left-hand side, you can see that some of the big companies, SpaceX, Virgin Galactic, and so on, OneWeb, Planet Labs, and they've had 200 million to 2 billion. Then slightly smaller, Spire, which I mentioned earlier, Space IL, an Israeli company. And then over on the right, at much smaller levels, you can see a much larger number of companies that have had smaller amounts of money. So Rocket Lab, I mentioned, NanoRacks, I mentioned. Some of these companies still exist. Some of them have disappeared. It's not guaranteed to be a success, but what you can see there on the bottom line is that from 2005 to 2015, 12 billion in private investment was made into new space companies. So there are people out there who do believe that it's possible to make significant money. And if we come much more up to date, on my last slide, Space Investment Quarterly, which is produced by Space Capital, says for this year, $12 billion was invested. So, in 10 years from 2005 to 2015, 12 billion was invested. In the first half of 2020, 12 billion was invested. So you can see there's been a rapid surge, enormous surge in the amount of money going into space companies. Now, admittedly, a lot of this went into fairly big space companies with well-established track records. But again, 300 million was allocated to early stage investments. And, since 2004, almost 900 space companies have received funding, to help them start up. And with 85% of that has actually happened in the last 5 or 6 years. So there's a lot of money going into space. And although this is called new space, my contention is that we should stop calling it new space. It was new space when it started happening, but now this is just the way space is, and it should just be called, space or space commerce. And I look forward to the developments in the future. Anyway, thank you for your attention. That's the end of the talk. I don't know how much time you have at your end, but I've certainly got 10 minutes or so I can answer questions if there are any. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. That was great interaction with you.
I'm glad you liked it.
Yeah, participants, do you have any other questions? You can proceed.
So either in the text box or assuming you can type in the text box or on audio or video. But if not, no worries. I know it's a Friday evening, the end of the week. I'll be going home, soon. So if you want to go home, that's fine.
Hello, sir.
Hello? Yeah.
Yeah. Sir, Pluto planet is there now, sir. Pluto,
yes, it's not considered a planet by the IAU. That's true. It's considered.
It still exists, sir.
Still exists, yeah, absolutely, still there. I mean, all they've done is to change the categorization of it. You know, this is one of those things that people like to do. You know, human beings like to categorize things, and so. But yeah, it's still there. I don't know that we'll send another mission to it very soon, but it was certainly very interesting to see, you know, all the photos of it that came back.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
No problem. Okay, I think we're done then. There's no more questions. So thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much for the invitation to talk tonight, and enjoy the rest of World Space Week. So take care. Bye all.
Yeah, sir. Yeah, one sec. Like everyone, can you all switch on your webcams, please? We'll take a screenshot, group photo. All the participants, please.
Well, there's a few people. Yeah, it's good to see you all.
Sir,
Yes?
Yeah, if you have any doubts, please make it fast.
Okay, so have we done the screenshot?
Yes, sir. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
Well,
thank you.
thank you once again. Have a good time, and see you in space, maybe.
Yes, thank you.
Bye all.
Bye bye, sir. Good night. Yeah, guys, you can